Can you stand up for me?
I'm sorry, what?
Stand up. I need to talk to you.
I'm just reading my Bible. Is something wrong?
You match a description we got. Black male, gray beard.
A description of what?
Put the Bible down and show me your hands.
My hands? I'm a pastor. I'm sitting here with a Bible.
I don't care who you are. ID, now.
This should have ended with a warning.
It was just after 1 in the afternoon. February cold, but the sun was doing its best. Reverend Terrence Winslow sat at a small metal table outside Grady's cafe, with a Bible open in front of him and a half-finished sweet tea going warm in the sun. He had been coming here 3 times a week for as long as anyone could remember. Grab a sandwich, sit outside, read a chapter or 2 before heading back across the street to New Hope Baptist. Then a voice cut through the quiet. "Sir, I need you to stand up." Winslow looked up. Officer Kyle Brennan stood a few feet away, one hand near his radio, the other resting on his belt. No smile, no explanation, just the command. Winslow blinked. "Excuse me?" Brennan said there had been reports, someone fitting his description, suspicious activity in the area. Winslow glanced around. The street was empty except for a couple walking a dog half a block down. He looked back at Brennan. Reports of what? The officer didn't answer the question. He just repeated himself. "Stand up. Show me your hands." What Brennan didn't know, couldn't have known, was that the man in front of him had spent the last 18 years serving on the city's Police Accountability and Community Relations Board. Winslow had sat in on misconduct hearings. He'd helped rewrite the department's racial bias training curriculum. He knew the Supreme Court cases. He knew the policy manual. He knew exactly what reasonable suspicion looked like. And this wasn't it. Winslow had just turned to the book of Proverbs when the shadow fell across his table. He looked up to see a police officer standing maybe 3 feet away, close enough that the movement felt deliberate. The officer's hand rested on his belt. His expression was flat, unreadable. "Sir, I need you to stand up." No introduction, no, "excuse me," just the command. Winslow blinked, setting his finger on the page to hold his place. "I'm sorry? Stand up. I need to see some identification." The cafe patio had been quiet a moment before, just the hum of passing cars and the faint scrape of chairs inside. Now it felt like the air had tightened. A woman at the table nearest the door glanced over, then looked away quickly. Winslow stayed seated. "Is there a problem, officer?" "I'll ask the questions. Stand up." Brennan's tone hadn't changed. It was the same flat authority he'd used from the start, like he was reading from a script he'd memorized years ago. Winslow recognized it. He'd heard it before, in disciplinary hearings, in complaints filed by residents, in the debriefs that followed body camera reviews. It was the tone of someone who expected compliance, not conversation. Winslow closed the Bible slowly and set it on the table. He didn't stand. "Can you tell me why you're asking for my ID?" Brennan's jaw tightened. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area. You match a description." "A description of what?" "Just show me your ID." Winslow glanced around. The street was almost empty. A couple walked their dog half a block down. A delivery truck idled near the corner. No commotion, no disturbance. Nothing that would explain why a uniformed officer was standing over him, demanding identification, while he sat outside a cafe with a Bible and a glass of tea. He looked back at Brennan. "What am I suspected of doing?" The officer exhaled through his nose, the kind of sound people make when they're losing patience. "Sir, if you don't cooperate, this is going to go a different way." Winslow kept his hands on the table where Brennan could see them. His voice stayed level. "I'm asking you a legal question. Under what suspicion are you requiring me to identify myself?" Brennan shifted his weight. "I already told you, reports of suspicious activity." "What activity?" "That's not your concern." "It is if you're asking for my identification." The exchange had the rhythm of a chess match, each move deliberate. Winslow had been through this before. Not personally, but in rooms with lawyers, union reps, and department supervisors. He knew how these encounters were supposed to work. An officer needs reasonable suspicion to conduct a stop. That suspicion has to be based on specific, articulable facts. Not a hunch, not a vague sense of unease, and certainly not someone's appearance. Bob Brennan clearly didn't want to provide those facts. "Are you refusing to show ID?" the officer asked. "I'm asking what law you believe I've broken. I don't have to explain myself to you." Winslow let the silence sit for a moment. Then he said, "Actually, you do. That's how this works." Brennan's hand moved slightly toward his radio. It wasn't a threat exactly, but it was close. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. I'm sitting at a table reading a Bible. I don't see how that's hard. You fit a description." "Of who?" Brennan didn't answer. Winslow could see the calculation happening behind the officer's eyes, whether to push harder, whether to call for backup, whether to escalate or walk away. It was a moment Winslow had seen described in incident reports dozens of times. The point where an officer either de-escalates or doubles down. Brennan doubled down. "Last time, ID now." Winslow didn't move. "I'd like to know what I'm being accused of." The officer's face hardened. "You're being detained for failure to comply." "Detained under what statute?" Brennan didn't have an answer for that either. Brennan's voice took on a sharper edge. "There have been reports of thefts in this area over the last few days. You match the description of a suspect." Winslow looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "What thefts?" "Multiple reports, commercial break-ins." "Where?" Brennan gestured vaguely down the block. "In this vicinity." Winslow knew the neighborhood. He'd been coming to this cafe 3 times a week for the better part of a decade. New Hope Baptist was directly across the street. He lived 10 minutes away. If there had been a string of thefts, he would have heard about it. From the business owners, from parishioners, from the neighborhood watch meetings he attended twice a month. "Officer, I haven't heard about any break-ins around here." "Well, there have been." "When?" Brennan hesitated. "Just a beat, but enough. Though over the past week." "Which businesses?" "That's not something I'm going to discuss with you." Winslow leaned back slightly in his chair. His voice stayed calm, almost conversational. "I ask because I'm here regularly. I know most of the owners on this block. If someone had been broken into, I think I would have heard." Brennan's expression didn't change, but something in his posture stiffened. "Are you calling me a liar?" "I'm saying I haven't heard about any thefts, and I'm still not clear on why you think I'm involved." The officer's hand moved back to his belt. "You match the description, which is black male, older, glasses." Winslow let that sit in the air for a second. Then he said, "That's not a description. That's half the men in this neighborhood." Brennan's face flushed slightly, but he didn't back down. "Now I'm going to need you to stand up and show me your ID." Winslow stayed seated. "And I'm going to need you to tell me what specific articulable facts led you to believe I'm involved in criminal activity." The words hung there. Specific, articulable, facts. The same language used in Terry versus Ohio, the Supreme Court case that set the standard for police stops. Winslow had helped train officers on that very case. Brennan's silence said everything. Winslow adjusted his glasses and folded his hands on the table. His voice stayed quiet, but there was something different in it now, a kind of clarity that comes from knowing exactly where you stand. "Officer, can I have your name and badge number?" Brennan froze. It wasn't a dramatic pause. He didn't stumble or look away. But something changed in his face. The confidence that had carried him through the last few minutes seemed to crack just slightly. "Why do you need that?" "Because I'm going to file a complaint." "A complaint for what?" "For conducting an unlawful stop without reasonable suspicion." Brennan's jaw worked. He looked at Winslow like he was trying to decide whether this was a bluff. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know exactly what I'm talking about." There was no anger in Winslow's voice, no raised pitch, and no edge. Just the steady tone of someone who'd spent years sitting across from officers in review hearings, reading case law, and drafting policy recommendations. He'd been in rooms where careers were decided. He knew how the process worked. Brennan seemed to realize in that moment that this wasn't going the way he'd expected. "My name is Officer Brennan, badge 4721. Winslow pulled a small notepad from his jacket pocket and wrote it down. Slowly, deliberately. Brennan watched him do it. "You're making a mistake," the officer said. Winslow looked up. "No, I don't think I am." He capped the pen and slid the notepad back into his pocket. Then he stood, picked up his Bible, and drained the last of his tea. Brennan didn't move. He just stood there, watching, as Winslow pushed his chair in and walked toward the street. "Oh, this isn't over," Brennan called after him. Winslow stopped, turned. "You're right, it's not." Then he walked away. The Bodycam kept recording. Brennan stood there for another 30 seconds, watching Winslow cross the street toward the church. Then he turned and walked back to his patrol car. He didn't call it in. Didn't file a report. Didn't mention the stop to anyone when he returned to the station at the end of his shift. He thought it was over. Winslow went back to his office at New Hope Baptist and sat down at his desk. He opened his laptop and pulled up the contact list for the Police Accountability and Community Relations Board, the same board he'd served on for 18 years. He scrolled to the name of the Internal Affairs Liaison and composed an email. Subject, formal complaint. Officer K. Brennan, badge 4721. He didn't write it in anger. He wrote it the way he'd learned to write everything related to the department. Factual, precise, and grounded in policy. He described the encounter in detail. He noted the time, the location, the lack of reasonable suspicion. He cited the relevant case law. He attached a copy of the department's own stop and frisk policy, the one he'd helped revise 3 years earlier. Then he hit send. The email arrived in the Internal Affairs inbox at 2:47 p.m. By 4 p.m., it had been flagged for review. By the next morning, a supervisor had pulled the Bodycam footage. The footage showed exactly what Winslow had described. An officer approaching a man sitting peacefully at a cafe, demanding identification without cause, fabricating reports of thefts that didn't exist, escalating when questioned, offering no legal justification for the stop. It also showed something else: the badge number, the timestamp, the location. Everything needed to cross-reference the stop against Brennan's activity log. When the supervisor ran that cross-reference, a pattern emerged. Internal Affairs pulled Brennan's stop records going back 4 years. The numbers told a story that couldn't be explained away. 68 stops. 61 of them involved black men. The other 7 were split between Latino men and one white teenager who'd been stopped outside a convenience store at 11 p.m. Of those 68 stops, only 4 resulted in arrests. None of those arrests involved serious crimes. One was a warrant for unpaid traffic tickets, 2 were for marijuana possession, and 1 was for disorderly conduct that got dismissed 3 weeks later. The rest, just stops. demands for ID. Searches that turned up nothing, warnings issued for infractions that were never clearly defined. The pattern was clear. Brennan wasn't responding to crime. He was stopping people based on race, then inventing justifications after the fact. The investigator assigned to the case pulled the reports Brennan had filed for each stop. Most of them were thin, 2 or 3 lines describing suspicious behavior or matching a description without providing details. A few mentioned high crime areas, even though the stops had occurred in neighborhoods with some of the lowest crime rates in the city. There was no reasonable suspicion. There was just a badge and a pattern. The investigator documented everything in a 23-page report. It included stop data, Bodycam transcripts, and a geographic analysis showing that Brennan's stops clustered in majority black neighborhoods, despite his patrol route covering a much wider area. The report landed on the desk of the precinct captain on a Thursday morning. By Friday afternoon, Brennan had been called in for a formal interview. No, I didn't have good answers. He repeated the same phrases: suspicious behavior, officer safety, routine stop. But none of them held up under scrutiny. When asked why 61 of his 68 stops involved black men, he said it was coincidence. The captain didn't buy it. Neither did the review board. Winslow didn't submit his complaint as just another aggrieved citizen. He submitted it as a board member with 18 years of institutional knowledge, someone who understood the department's policies because he'd helped write them. When the Police Accountability and Community Relations Board convened to review Brennan's case, Winslow was in the room. Not as a witness, but as a voting member. He'd recused himself from the initial investigation to avoid any appearance of bias, but once the internal affairs report was complete, he resumed his role. The board reviewed the stop data. They watched the body cam footage. They read the transcripts. Then they asked the questions that needed to be asked. Why had supervisors ignored previous complaints about Brennan's stop patterns? Why had no one flagged the disparity in his activity logs? Why had the department's own early intervention system, designed to catch exactly this kind of behavior, failed to trigger a review? The answers were uncomfortable. Complaints had been filed before. 3 times in the past 2 years, residents had alleged that Brennan had stopped them without cause. Each time, the complaint had been marked as unfounded or not sustained without a serious investigation. Supervisors had signed off on those findings without looking deeper. No one had pulled the data. No one had asked whether there was a pattern. Winslow's complaint changed that. Because it didn't just describe one encounter, it pointed to a system that had failed to hold an officer accountable until someone with institutional power forced the issue. The board's recommendation was clear: termination, in a mandatory retraining for the entire precinct, and a full audit of stop practices across the department. The chief accepted the recommendation. Brennan was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the review. 3 weeks later, he was terminated. The official reason cited in his personnel file was pattern of conduct inconsistent with department policy and constitutional standards. It was bureaucratic language, but it meant what everyone knew it meant. He'd been stopping people based on race, and the department could no longer ignore it. The fallout didn't stop with Brennan. The precinct captain who'd signed off on the earlier complaints without investigating them received a formal reprimand and was reassigned to a desk job. 2 shift supervisors were required to complete additional training on stop documentation and bias recognition. The department announced a comprehensive audit of stop and frisk practices across all precincts. In every stop conducted over the past 3 years would be reviewed for patterns of racial disparity. Officers with concerning patterns would be flagged for additional oversight. It was the kind of systemic review that advocacy groups had been calling for years. It took a pastor with a Bible and a Bodycam to make it happen. News of Brennan's termination spread quickly. Some officers saw it as overreach, a good cop getting railroaded for doing his job. Others saw it as long overdue accountability for behavior that had been ignored for too long. The Police Accountability Board issued a public statement acknowledging the department's failures and committing to stronger oversight. Winslow didn't give interviews. He didn't seek attention. He just went back to his office at New Hope Baptist and continued the work he'd been doing for the past 18 years. But he also did one more thing. He filed a federal lawsuit. The lawsuit alleged violations of Winslow's Fourth and 14th Amendment rights, unlawful search and seizure, and denial of equal protection under the law. It named Brennan, the precinct captain, and the city as defendants. The city's attorneys tried to settle quickly. They knew what the body cam footage showed. They knew what the stop data revealed. They knew a jury would see a 64-year-old pastor sitting outside a cafe with a Bible, and they knew how that would play in court. 8 months after the encounter, the city agreed to a settlement, $725,000. The agreement included no admission of liability, but it included something else. A consent decree requiring the department to implement bias training, revise its stop and frisk policies, and submit to independent oversight for the next 5 years. Winslow donated a portion of the settlement to a legal defense fund for residents who couldn't afford attorneys. He used the rest to fund a community policing fellowship that would bring young people into conversations with officers about accountability and trust. But the most lasting impact came from something simpler. The Bodycam footage of Brennan's stop became required viewing at the police academy. Every recruit now watches it during their training on constitutional policing. They see an officer demand ID without cause. They see him fabricate justifications. They see him escalate when questioned, and they're asked, what should he have done differently? It's a 12-minute video that ends a career and starts a conversation. It's a reminder that authority without accountability doesn't protect anyone. It just shifts who gets hurt. Brennan never worked in law enforcement again. Winslow is still on the Police Accountability Board, and the policy he helped write, the one Brennan violated, is now the one used to train every officer who comes after him. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more stories like this. Your support truly means a lot.